Hi there, and welcome to episode 6. This is the gap between what you're taught and what can cost you everything. So if you've been listening to my show from the beginning, then you already know this isn't just a podcast about hypotheticals. This is a podcast about what actually happens when real providers collide with real systems. We started this series with Clinic Under Fire, that moment when everything you've worked for suddenly feels unstable. Then we talked about investigations in healthcare, the hidden mistakes that providers don't realize they're making, documentation that looks fine until it isn't, and that dangerous mindset of everyone does it until suddenly it's the problem. So today's episode is the connective tissue between all of those. Because today, I want to talk about what it truly means to be a real-world provider. Not the provider you imagined you'd be when you graduated, not the provider your textbooks prepared you to be, but the provider you became the moment scrutiny enters into your practice. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most providers don't get into trouble because they're careless. They get into trouble because they were never taught how the real world actually works. So let's talk about the illusion of training. So healthcare education teaches you how to practice in an ideal environment, a world where policies are followed, staff does what they're trained to do, charts are complete, oversight is reasonable, and intent matters. But that's not what the environment regulators operate in. The real world is busy. It's understaffed. It's rushed. It's full of interruptions, competing priorities, technology failures, and human error. And here's the disconnect that no one talks about. We train providers for clinical excellence, but we regulate them for administrative perfection. And no one teaches us how exposed you become once you step outside traditional employment. No one teaches you that the moment you open your own clinic, your charting is no longer just patient care. It's potential evidence. And no one teaches you that good medicine and defensible medicine are not the same thing. And no one teaches you that when something goes wrong, regulators don't ask, well, did you mean well? They ask, can you prove it? And most providers don't get disciplined because they provided poor care. They get disciplined because their care couldn't be defended on paper. And that distinction matters more than people realize. So let's talk about the myth that I'll just explain. So one of the most dangerous beliefs that providers carry is this: if something ever comes up, I'll just explain it. That belief is comforting, but it's also wrong. And regulatory bodies are not there to hear your story. They're there to assess the risk. And they don't investigate you to understand you. They investigate you to determine exposure, which is yours and theirs. And when boards or regulators communicate, the language is intentional. There's urgency, formal wording, implied consequences, and short timelines. And that pressure is not accidental. It's part of the process. Fear narrows your thinking. Fear makes you talk. Fear makes you over-explain. And fear makes you cooperate without strategy. And once something is said, written, or signed, it becomes permanent. And providers often mistake politeness for safety. They mistake calm tones for fairness. And they mistake helpful language for protection. But tone does not equal outcome. And the system is not designed to walk you through your best defense. So let's talk about how fear hijacks your decision-making. This is where I want you to really listen, because the most damaging decisions that providers make are not clinical. They're emotional. And they happen when you're scared, you're exhausted, you feel cornered, or you're just told that you need to decide right now. There's consent agreements, voluntary surrenders, informal resolutions, and just sign this and they'll be over, or this is the safest option. And another one is, you can always address it later, because fear makes these options feel like relief. But here's the part no one tells you. What feels safe in the moment can follow you for years. Regulatory decisions don't end cases. They create histories. And those histories get shared. They get referenced. They get reinterpreted. And they resurface when you least expect them. A decision made under pressure doesn't stay in that moment. It becomes part of your professional identity. And that's devastating when you realize, too late, that you were never given the full picture. So let's talk about real-world consequences. And here's something that providers don't realize until they're living it. You don't get credit for what should have happened. You get judged on what can be proven. And if documentation is missing, it's assumed incomplete. If a prescription can't be verified, it's assumed it's not filled. And if a patient says something inaccurate, it still enters the record. Truth does not protect you, documentation does. And once you're in a position where you have to defend yourself without proof, the power of imbalance becomes painfully clear. You're no longer explaining, you're responding. You're no longer clarifying, you're justifying. And often you're being asked to admit to things, not because they happen, but because you can't disprove them. And that is one of the most terrifying positions a provider can be in. So let's talk about why certain specialties are targeted. And if you practice or plan to practice in things like weight loss, aesthetics, hormone therapy, or primary care ownership, you need to understand this. These spaces are heavily scrutinized, not because they're unethical, but because they involve cash pay, prescribing authority, high patient volume, and public misunderstanding. And that combination attracts attention. And many providers walk into these fields clinically prepared, but administratively naked. And they assume that doing good work is enough when it isn't. And visibility without protection is vulnerability. So what a real-world provider does differently. A real-world provider understands this early. You are not just a clinician, you are a regulated entity. A real-world provider documents like someone else will read it someday, or trains staff like mistakes will be audited. They question standard practice, slows down when pressured, and understands when not to speak. They don't rely on intent, they rely on structure. They don't assume protection, they build it. And they understand that silence can be safer than explanation. And policies matter, training logs matter, and consistency matters. And most importantly, they understand that fear is not strategy. So I want to talk to you about why Clinic Under Fire exists. And this is exactly why. This is not to scare providers, and it's not to tell horror stories, but to close the gap between education and reality, to teach providers how regulatories actually think, how documentation actually functions, and how decisions made under pressure can shape careers. Because no one should learn these lessons when their license is already on the line. Preparation should happen before fear enters the room. So let's get calm, grounded, and empowering. Because a real-world provider doesn't mean being clinical. It means being informed. It means understanding that good care still needs proof, and that documentation is not busy work, it's your defense, and that compliance without strategy is dangerous. And if you're building something of your own, do it prepared, do it aware, and do it protected. Fear is loud, preparation is quiet, but preparation lasts longer. This is the real world provider, and this is the conversation no one has with you until it's too late.